Well, it's the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for coming in, and I know that people are starting to join. It is 12 o'clock on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, it's 9 a.m. And so we want to welcome you to our next installment of Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness Through a New Lens. And we're honored today, someone I've been working with for the last couple of months, Paula Daniels, who's the co-founder, and I like this title, co-founder and chief of What's Next at the Center for Good Food Systems. And today we're going to talk about reimagining good food systems. And for some of you who are in this arena, this would be a good conversation. But for some of us, it would be really an introduction into kind of what food systems are. So, Paul, I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Let's talk about first, let's start with your journey. Could you talk about your journey in this space and kind of give us an overview of your organization and the important work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that. I think my sort of journey begins and circles back to Hawaii, which is the spot on the map here. And the background behind me is an image of our logo from the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and then places where we have a presence throughout the country. This is a map that sort of shows like an indication of where our work is. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. But basically, I'm from Hawaii and I'm part Hawaiian. And like many places in the country, in the world, Hawaii was subject to let's say, a certain political and economic approach to managing food and the production of food and let's say even textiles. How agriculture has been managed in this world has often been a system of exploitation and extraction. And Hawaii is one example. There are many others. We certainly had the example in the South with cotton production. And Hawaii was a independent nation with a diversified economy up until contact in the 18th century. And then over time, Western contact, meaning England and the United States, influenced Hawaii's politics and then also began to have a hold over its business. And then in 1893, Hawaii was overthrown completely. It was a sovereign nation, but it was taken illegally and by force. It's well documented that that is exactly what happened. And for the sake of sugar, for the sake of agriculture production, to increase production of sugar shortly after the close of the Civil War, America was looking for another place to do this and have a lot of sugar production. It's such an irony, that the whole country was overthrown for something that we've now learned can be quite harmful in excess. And, in some ways, the excess of ambition there really impacted a whole country. So what was an entity that, a nation that had been able to sustainably feed itself, the ancient Hawaiians had a population of close to what we have now, it's estimated, and yet they were able to sustainably feed themselves for centuries in partnership with the environment without having any form of actual land ownership, but more a form of land stewardship. So a country that was able to sustain itself became a state due to this overthrow and now cannot. It is subject to importing. About 90 to 95% of its food is imported. Because the land was taken over for industrialized agriculture and then turned into private ownership and then turned into other things. So there's always been a tragedy at the heart of how Hawaii manages its food system in the modern era. And my father, so I'm part Hawaiian, was raised on a sugar plantation. I don't want to go on too long about this. I'll just share a little bit more of a story that my grandfather's grandfather had been a judge on Maui and was a congressman to the Kingdom of Hawaii. And when the overthrow happened, he refused to take the oath of office to the self-installed illegal government, and they sent him to work in the ditches they kicked him out of office and sent him to work in the ditches of the sugar plantation. So the Daniels family, from generations on after that, was raised on sugar plantations, which are basically labor camps in Hawaii. So I grew up with that knowledge. I grew up with my grandfather working at the mill. It was a job he appreciated. He was a maintenance engineer, but the idea that all we were producing in Hawaii was sugar when I was growing up and we had to import all this food and it wasn't very good, stayed with me my whole life. I became very interested in environmental issues. My grandfather was teaching me when I was very young the core principles of the Hawaiian ethos of malama aina, or stewardship of the land. And at that time, it wasn't a well-known concept. It was still something we were all, just trying to grapple with in Hawaii in terms of our orientation to the world. And he was remembering those traditional ways. So that led me to be very interested in environmental stewardship. I'll fast forward now through this part, but I ended up becoming an attorney. That I was a private sector attorney. I represented corporations, but then started volunteering with organizations that offered environmental protection, particularly for the ocean. So there was a group called Heal the Bay here in California that I volunteered for, and then became a leader and a chair of the board. From that led me to be appointed to various government positions related to environmental water quality. I served on the California Coastal Commission. I served on the Bay Delta Authority Board. All of this looking at how we can responsibly manage water with respect to its impacts and relationship to replenishment, of the earth and the systems. That led me to thinking about how we can influence food systems, because the water use, especially in California, California is 100% irrigated agriculture. In other states, it's not necessarily, but there's a big water system that I was appointed board member to oversee with others. And I started thinking about how can we make an impact on this food system, which has the consequences that I carried with me from Hawaii, but also you see in almost every place around this country, at least, and in many places around the world. In the Central Valley of California, there are laborers working to grow food, specialty crops in this instance, not necessarily sugar, but it's exported. So the local food in the Central Valley of California is also just 10 to 15%. This is also true in Iowa, which has a lot of very fertile soils. It's mostly growing corn and other, subsidized grains that have been, it's a mid-20th century model. And there are folks that would trying to get more localized food production there. So, and we could talk about why that's valuable in a second, but this is happening in almost everywhere around the world, where folks are thinking about, wait a minute, what is this food system that we ended up with, that we designed in the mid-century? So we came up with a theory of change that what if we used the procurement dollars, purchasing power of major public institutions to signal to the agricultural economy, we will support you if you grow food that's local and supports our local economies and supports our small businesses and our socially disadvantaged producers and producers of color. We will support you for growing environmentally sustainable food that respects water and soil and animals. We will support you if you have fair labor practices. So that's the idea of our procurement program. And we are now in 25 regions around the country. So it started in LA. We're throughout California, San Francisco, Fresno in the Central Valley. We're in New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh. we're in Florida. We're in like all these places, including Hawaii, my home state. Okay, that wasn't a very short answer, but that's kind of my journey.
Yeah, it was a necessary one. Just to reset for those who just joined us, thank you so much. We're talking with Paula Daniels, who's the co-founder at the Center for Good Food Systems. And today we're talking about reimagining good food systems. And so, Paula, you started to do this in your answer, but maybe we could talk about it a little bit more succinctly. Before we even talk about what a good food system is, could you describe what a food system? What is that, and kind of how does that relate to us and the people who are looking at today?
Yeah.
Can we talk about what a food system is?
Yeah. Well, our current food system is a highly networked system with a lot of specialized intermediaries. I do teach a food policy class from time to time, and I show a map. I don't have it ready today, but I show my students a map that looks like, I don't expect them to answer any questions on it, but it looks like a spider web. There's just all sorts of stuff going on in the food system. It is a system. So it is an interdependent set of actions that influence the entire system, that influence the outcomes of the system. So it's everything from production to distribution to consumption is generally what's thought of as the supply chain. But the supply chain is just one part of what a system means. So in the case of the food system, there's a lot of policy that impacts how the system works. And most of what our system today is, as I mentioned earlier, is a mid-century, mid-20th century policy design. So up until about the middle part of the 20th century, we had a more localized food system. Lower income people had actually very good diets because they were growing their own food in their backyard, or they were getting food from local farms. There were a lot of local farms. Most production was in smaller farms. So we celebrated sort of the Thomas Jefferson idea of an agrarian society. We slowly became more of a centralized system around food. And that happened after World War II, where there were a lot of inventions around how to synthesize chemicals, one of which was nitrogen, which is used as a fertilizer. So we had a bunch of synthesized materials that we learned about it, and that mid-century ethos was, hey, we've got all this engineering, let's use it, and let's just use it to produce more of what we need. The other, so that was around food. So we began to use more synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, but also there was a public policy push then to compete with Russia in post-war. And so a lot of investment subsidies went into growing grain because Russia was growing grain. We know about this now. We've just heard about a deal with Ukraine and Russia around grain production and how that's going to impact food prices worldwide. So that was a concern in the mid 20th century. So the US pumped a whole bunch of policy into let's produce all this grain so we compete with Russia. Well, what that ended up doing was creating a grain dependent system. And what do people do with all this excess grain? Well, they make, Pop-Tarts. Do you know what I mean? Nothing wrong with Pop-Tarts. I had them growing up, for breakfast. I love the blueberry flavored one. But the point is that you're making this over processed food that we now know causes public health impacts. And it's also, there's an unfairness about what's cheap now in society that sort of pushes that public health thing to a distorted place.
Right. I just wanted to note that Ellie Crowell sent a note, and I wanted to just kind of cite this for you and get maybe your reaction. Paula's calling in from Philadelphia. Paula, I would love it if we could advocate for the types of things you're talking about, and in ways that also could impact the food banks system, an extremely imperfect piece of nonprofit industrial complex, so that we're getting more localized, nutrition rich, environmentally sustainable food to folks who are experiencing food insecurity, many of whom are also trapped in cycles of systematic poverty and racism. So I think this is a good topic because this is part of what you just talked about. There's some of the systemic things that are happening because of some of the history that you gave, but kind of leading to that. Any comments on this comment? Thank you, Ellie, for your comment.
Yeah, Ellie, that is a good comment. There have been, there's so many public, this is all part of that system too. There's a lot of investment at the federal level in public health on that side of the food system, which would include SNAP, or also called food stamps, WIC, which is for women and infant children, and food banks. And I'm not as deeply familiar with food banks as other parts of the system, but it is a program that gets a lot of state and federal funds. And there's some restrictions on how those funds work. So it's made it difficult for food banks to do exactly what Ellie's saying. But I think there is now a farm to food bank program, which I looked into recently, and different states deploy it differently. I think California had about over $700,000 in the farm to food bank program. Other places might only have, 18,000 where they've spent that money, but they're trying to make it more available for food banks to be able to buy local food. This is a little bit of a consequence of the pandemic, when we had those supply chains that I talked about, those highly intermediated supply chains, which are now global and they're very confusing and opaque. The more direct supply chains will support a more local food economy and a more equitable food economy where you have more, less people in between the relationships and more mission. So the farm to food bank program came out of COVID when there was all this food rotting in the fields, all this need for food. Why can't we get it, from one place to another? It's because of that complex system. So the farm to food bank program, I think Ellie could speak to this better, I think, than me, but amped up in that time. I certainly know some places like North Carolina did a lot of local purchasing. So I want to also point out in Philadelphia that you have a very, very good nonprofit called the Common Market that was founded in Philadelphia. It's run by some fantastic human beings who have a mission of a more equitable food system and to get food from local smaller farmers to places of need. And my understanding is they are serving food banks as well. They are distributing to food banks. So Ellie, if you don't know of the Common Market, I recommend that we make a connection for you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
They're now in 4 places around the country. They started in Philadelphia. They're also in Atlanta. They're in East Texas, and they just opened in Chicago. So they act as the trusted intermediary, the single point between the farmer and the institutions that would want to acquire this food. So to schools, like in New York, to food banks is my understanding. They also have some other programs as well.
In your answer, Paula, the pandemic, we're kind of post-pandemic, and I wanted to ask a little bit to go a little bit deeper on that, as far as the pandemic's impact on food systems. So I know that, for example, a lot of things around restaurant workers, which is part of the end portion of a pandemic, but it also had a lot of disruption within the system itself. And you started to mention some of that. I wanted to see if we can go a little bit deeper, but what are maybe some of the good things that the pandemic, although we don't wish a pandemic on us, may have had an impact on the food system? And let's talk. I'd love for you to go a little bit deeper on that. The pandemic's impacts on food systems.
Well, I think I guess I'm happy to be post the stage where we're saying in almost every conversation what the pandemic revealed.
Yes, right.
We're kind of a year past that now, because we learned so much in so many ways about how our systems work during the pandemic, because we do know we're a very globalized system. And when that all shut down and we had to kind of rethink how our systems work, we realized that something localized in so many respects would be helpful. So that was, I think, the biggest learning from the pandemic from a food system standpoint was what I mentioned earlier about having a more localized supply chain. It's more resilient. So if you have some kind of a disaster, whether it be a natural disaster, which we're going to have more of, unfortunately, or a public health disaster, this type of thing that shuts down supply chains. If you have a connection to the growing regions in your area, you're going to be more resilient. This comes up a lot in Hawaii. I'll use Hawaii again as an example. So in this map, Hawaii is like just tucked right under Texas. Well, in fact, it's in the middle of the Pacific. Hawaii is the most remote population in the world. It's 2,500 miles from anywhere. And so it's the most remote population. So Hawaii is, I told you that it was self-sustaining from a food system standpoint. Now it's not. So when you have these hurricanes that are beginning to go closer to Hawaii because of the warming ocean currents, cargo ships will not sail into that area. So that's how food's getting to Hawaii. If airplanes travel, because there's also a lot of food that comes through airplane cargo, that will be a problem. So growing more locally in Hawaii is a matter of actual system security, so that if you don't get imports, then you can grow it there. I would argue that that's true for just about anywhere. So however the supply chains might shut down, at least you have something within your region that you're supporting. So just from that practicality of being a more resilient system, that's what we learned from COVID. But then we also learned a lot about worker treatment. So I think a really strong example is in the meat production system. That's a good example for 2 levels. One is that's a highly attenuated global supply chain. Meat is now, I mean, it used to be we had a lot of ranchers and farmers producing food. Now we have mostly highly consolidated corporations, vertically integrated models of producing food. So there's 4 meat companies that dominate meat production and distribution in the US. Globally, it's 6. So you got 6 companies in the world managing all the meat distribution, which is a lot. And then during the pandemic, we learned, that there were just maybe 4 meat processing plants in the country. If the workers were impacted by COVID and couldn't process the meat, that whole supply chain backs up, right? But also they were making them work really difficult jobs. This is the area that is most subject to injury to folks. It's one of the most difficult jobs among the many difficult jobs in the food system is meat processing. And they were having to work in order to keep that bottleneck or open up that bottleneck. There's better ways to do it. There's local abattoirs for meat processing, and the USDA has risen to the occasion and has funded local food system infrastructure. So they're doing a lot along those lines. With this administration, seeing what happened in the pandemic kind of gave a rocket fuel boost to their interest in making those changes and those investments.
So let's talk about what a good food system is. How do you've been talking about it throughout your comments, and I'm really appreciative of that. But I wanted to talk about let's kind of like, what's a good food system? What's an equitable food system? And let me get your reaction to that.
Yeah. Well, we spent a lot of time defining it as we developed our program, the Good Food Purchasing Program. And let me add that the program came out of a stakeholder-based process. So in order to get to where we knew what we wanted to do in Los Angeles, we created the Food Policy Council first. And the work for that started in 2009 when I was in the mayor's office. And then we created a task force to see if we should have a Food Policy Council and what we should think about and do. And one of the recommendations of the task force was to create a procurement program. We then started a Food Policy Council in 2011. We started the research on purchasing programs in 2010. We had a 2-year research and development process to get to where we had the framework for the for the Good Food Purchasing Program. And that process included thinking about what did we value in the food system and what was a good food system. So we came up with the 5 value categories that are a key part of the Good Food Purchasing Program, which are to support local economies and small and farmers and socially disadvantaged farmers, to support environmental sustainability, to support fair labor practices, to support nutritional health and animal welfare. So those 5 value categories to our group of stakeholders that were informing our process over 2 years represent what a good food system would be. There's other ways to describe it. There are, the UN has a definition of agroecology. So agroecology says the same thing I just told you about 5 value categories. We broke it down into the schematic. But basically what you're talking about is a holistic system that respects people, all people, and the planet, and the beings on it. It's as simple and as difficult as that. I mean, it may not be difficult in ancient times in all cultures, but it's difficult now in the society we've created. Right. It's just important to keep it forward. Maybe I shouldn't say difficult. Let me just say complex. It's as simple and complex as total respect for that. And the United Nations has a definition of agroecology on its website. If you're interested, you could just Google, United Nations agroecology, and it'll show you the 10 elements of what the United Nations thinks are important in a holistic food system. Agroecology meaning the system works well as an interdependent whole and not just on one part or another. The system currently works from the production standpoint, and I'm doing this like it's a chart, like production, yay, is what the system is designed for, and profit standpoint for many of the multinational companies, but not working so well on the other end of the scale. So making it more holistic is what a good food system is. And there's lots of definitions. I could show you a few more, but that's the basic concept.
Makes sense. If you can help people on a call become advocates for equitable and good food systems, what are some of the things that you would advise them that they could do within the sphere of their influence?
Well, what we've done is create a program that uses purchasing dollars at scale. So we work with public institutions mostly that have multi-million-dollar food budgets. For example, LAUSD is $150 million a year food budget. New York has more. Chicago. So we're looking at billions of dollars worth of purchasing. I'm talking about purchasing on purpose because everybody has dollars to spend on food. We're looking at scale. We're also looking at the federal government level where there's about $8 billion in direct purchasing from federal institutions. We're trying to influence their purchasing. I think it's, we often talk about, can you vote with your food dollar? I think that's individuals can certainly do that and can make these very informed choices when at the grocery store. There's lots of seals and certifications that indicate if something has been produced with fair labor. We work closely with a partner called the Equitable Food Initiative that works very, very intently and very successfully, I would say, on good jobs in the food system, working with farmers on their farms, helping them to be advocates for themselves, helping them to be in partnership with the producer so that together they can have a good relationship with the production and all the people that work on it. There's like an example, Swanton Berry Farms, that's an organic berry farm in Northern California, but they also have union labor. I think we've seen how helpful collective bargaining can be for those who don't otherwise have advocacy power in their institutions. So looking for those types of certifications is helpful. I've always bought organic when it became available back in the 90s. It takes me a long time to buy something because I stand there and read all the ingredients and look at this. But that's my happy place, shopping in a grocery store and thinking like, oh, look what went into it. Because you can also look at any food product and you start thinking about the whole system that went behind getting it into your hand. It's not something to take casually in my mind. I think it's a privilege to be able to hold something really well produced in your hands and to be able to consume it and reward the producers for that, for doing it well.
I think we have 2 minutes left. I want to ask, my daughter actually is going, made a decision to get into to the food system and is going to the Culinary Institute of Arts to pursue chef, but she also is interested in purchasing. And so how have you seen the industry for women, minorities, the growth? What are some of your top level observations about the growth in the future for young people here?
There are so many opportunities to engage in the food system. I'm glad to hear your daughter's going into culinary arts. That's a really important intersection. I feel like the chefs are the avatars of a good food system because chefs make the decisions about their artistic expression of food conveys so much about their choices. And so they have these choices that can reflect the best of what the food system can be. And most of them do. Most of them think a lot about their ingredients. So I don't know too many chefs who go to culinary arts school to think, I want to make a better, highly processed, mass-produced meal. No, they're thinking about what does this food tell me about its own beauty that I can convey to the person who's going to eat it. And I just think that artistry is tremendous and so appreciated. So they have always been messengers and the first line of messaging for how important it is to deal respectfully with the food system. So that I'm hearing that there's a lot more jobs in like prepared meals too, because the supermarket has sort of changed from a lot of folks are going there for prepared meals, so there's an opportunity there. But otherwise, I'm seeing more and more jobs in the food system. When I first started this work in 2009, it was more of an idea than a movement, and lots of people wanted to get involved, but there weren't any jobs. I was volunteering my time, and a lot of the people who were helping were volunteering their time. And now there's more organizations. There's a lot of nonprofits that are doing this work. Even the common market, the food hubs that are coming up, those are the intermediaries between the producer and the purchaser. There's a lot of them coming up around the country. They're nonprofit as well. So there's lots of ways to look at where the jobs are, and also to think about why aren't we putting more people into this system that can be so much better if localized, right? Localized meaning you're going to have an intention that your region will support this system. And it's not just about local, but also about the good production in that region. That why wouldn't that just be, it's so much more healthy for the economy and for the world, actually. So.
Well, thank you. This has been an interesting conversation. More to follow, so much more to talk about, but we want to thank you for spending this last half an hour with us. Thank you to Paula Daniels. Thank you to all of our tech team that helped put this together. And we'll be back here next week when we talk about equity in construction. And looking forward to seeing you. Paula, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.